He was invisible by design, not because he wanted to be, but because a life built on small, urgent tasks teaches you to move without asking for attention. Sam Reyes knew every alley shortcut between the downtown hotels and the gated estates. He knew the sound a parcel made when it landed softly on a doormat at 2 in the afternoon, and the polite way strangers pretended not to notice the man in the uniform who left it there. Men like Sam are a city's quiet muscle, necessary, reliable, and easily forgotten. The van's engine sighed as rain began to lace the windshield. Sam thumbed up the collar of his jacket, glanced at the manifest on the passenger seat, and pushed the door closed with a practiced hand. Daylight smeared across the glass like watercolor. Tire treads whispered on wet pavement. The job was mundane. One stop left, an errand for a private client in a street of shuttered houses, where wealthy houses stood like thoughtful islands, and smaller homes were boarded up, a patchwork of neglect. He noticed the house because the mailbox had a child's sticker, faded stars around the name Isabella. The name tugged at him as he passed. He shouldn't have stopped. He had delivery deadlines and a van full of packages that would earn him his night's tip. But the sound was the reason he turned around. A crack of noise, almost swallowed by the rain, a sound too fragile to belong to the weather. A child's whimper. Not quite a sob, more of a breath that had lodged somewhere small and could not find its way out. Sam killed the engine and listened. The city was a quilt of sounds, sirens, the distant clatter of a bus, someone yelling at a dog, but under it all was that thin animal sound again. He set the package down, its label punching a pale square onto the gray canvas of his hand, and walked toward the house. The front yard was a tangle of untended grass and sagging fences. A swing hung at a crooked angle from a rusted chain. Boards covered the windows like tired eyelids. As he drew closer, the whimpers sharpened into syllables. Help. Please. The voice was whisper raw and very small. It was not an emergency he could ignore. Sam pressed his ear to the warped wood of the porch and felt the heartbeat of the house as if it were breathing. Inside, behind a half-blocked window, a sliver of movement. Dark hair, a tiny wrist, a flash of a bracelet catching the gray light. A charm, perhaps a dolphin, twinned against a bead. The bracelet sat like a punctuation mark, something meant to be noticed if anyone ever looked closely enough. He found a gap between two boards and crouched. The world narrowed to the scrape of his boots and the pulse in my throat. Through the cracked glass I saw her fully, a girl no older than 9, shoulders hunched, eyes that had learned to stay small to avoid being taken further. She watched him with the taut alertness of someone who measures danger in inches.
"Hey," Sam whispered, though he was not certain whether the sound reached her. He raised a hand slowly, palms open. "It's okay. I'm here." Her gaze flicked, measured him up, uniformed stranger, the type who delivered things and left, and then the muscles in her face eased marginally, as if she had just decided whether to trust the weather. "Please," she said, and the single syllable carried years. The cry that had stopped him was not simply a plea for rescue. Within the next hour, Sam would learn that while the whimper brought him to the porch, it was sound used as a weapon inside, an accidental slip in a conversation between people who believed themselves clever and safe. From the shadow near the kitchen door, he heard voices, 2 adult voices, heated and laughing in a way that had teeth. They moved like predators through the house's rooms, their speech muffled but emphatic. The cadence of laughter and the clink of glass made a chilling composition. Sam recognized the timbre. The woman was smirking, triumphant. The man was calculating, quiet with confidence. They celebrated as if they had already won. "We'll keep it moving," a definite voice said. "No loose ends, nobody gets to ask questions." The words were not explicit, not yet. No talk of crimes or bodies. The conspirators relied on euphemism to have their cruelty. They spoke of documents, of obituaries, of creating a story so perfect no one would look twice. They laughed about how well they'd staged everything, how they'd already prepared the memorial. Sam's hands tightened around the damp wood. He realized, with an empty feeling that reached his fingers, that the sticker on the mailbox had been honest. Isabella's name sat under a child's stars, a sliver of someone's private life. The conversation moving inside the house reframed the silence. This wasn't a case of neglect. It was a carefully folded plan, a performance designed to bury questions and buy them a future built on a child's absence. He slipped back to the van to keep some distance. Rain blurred the streetlights into long coins of light. He was making motions that anyone watching would call small and reasonable, dialing his phone, opening voice memos on instinct. He cleared his throat, started a recording like it was a habit and not a lifeline, and then, discreetly, set the phone in his pocket and walked back to the boarded house. Inside, the girl's name was spoken with the familiarity of ownership. "Stella has the obit in her purse," the woman said with a hushed giggle. "Mark already called the papers. We're golden. Once the procession goes, the world will close the book." Sam crouched lower, the damp seeping through his jacket, and the girl's small face was nearer now, looking at him over splintered wood. She mouthed, "Don't. It's dangerous." Her lips barely moved. He could see the shape of each tiny fear like beads falling on a string. He gestured again, more clearly this time, and she nodded, inflexible with caution.
She gave him a name, Isabella. He learned between the hushed lines of conversation and the girl's frightened replies that her father, Adrian Hale, a man with money and reputation, a man often abroad, had been told of a tragic accident, that the woman inside, Stella, had claimed the role of grieving stepmother, that the man, Mark, had pretended to be an uncle concerned for the family's reputation. Their voices were slick with the reward of a story that stacked tidy against moral complexity. They'd rehearsed their faces and emails and had already spoken with a lawyer about custody options after the tragedy. Isabella's body language contradicted the script they had written for the world. She was no passive thing to be mourned. She had learned to listen, to memorize the small, useless things that adults leave in the air. Dates, names, the micro phrases that thread into proof. She knew where they'd hidden a key in the plant pot behind the stove, and she repeated it to Sam in a clipped whisper, eyes darting as if the boards themselves had ears. "We can't go to the police," she said finally, in a voice flattened by the kind of weariness children are denied. "If they go, they'll say I'm confused. They'll say I wandered off. Stella will cry, and Mark will say it's private. Dad's in Geneva." The name, Adrian Hale, hung in the air like a file stamped with influence. Sam listened and catalogued. He had grown up around people who used connections like shawls. You didn't see the threadwork until you reached for the fabric. He knew the city had doors that opened for certain calls. He also knew it had many more doors that slammed shut if the right voices were on the other side. Stella and Mark. He could imagine their type. Smooth, practiced faces that never showed the small moral fissures that betray them. They were prepared to harvest people's belief for their own gain. He tucked his phone deeper into his pocket, hand pressed like a compass against his thigh. The recording would be crude, wind and rain and a private voice, but it would be a tether, proof that such words had been spoken within earshot. He had learned that sometimes the most useful weapon is a small mechanical thing that simply refuses to vanish. "Do you have anywhere to go?" he asked, kneeling so that his eyes met hers at her level. Her lashes were wet without tears, like someone who keeps salt in their throat to stop their face from betraying them. She nodded to the gap in the back wall, to a hollowed-out space they used for people's coats, and then to the mix of perfume and menace from the other room where the adults spoke. "You can't keep me," she whispered. "They'll notice." "Then we won't keep you," Sam said. It was not a vow. It was a plan being formed in the quiet places of his gut. "We get you out. We keep you somewhere safe. We get proof." The child's nod was small.
She believed him in the way small people believe someone who offers them shelter, because hope is a fragile currency, and he had given it to her without asking for interest. Her courage, however, surprised him. Isabella's fingers clenched into the bracelet that served as her only ornament, and perhaps the most honest piece of evidence she had, a bead with a little dolphin that had been part of a family gift, a tangible link to the life they intended to make disappear. Sam taught himself to move like someone without a target. He used the shadow of the van to pull Isabella through the back, keeping his hand on the small of her shoulder. The plan would have been laughable in another life, a man with a delivery badge and a little girl slipping through an estate's blind spots. They moved with the kind of silence that comes from people who have no option except to be quiet and quick. They reached a hedged alley behind the houses. Isabella's breath came out in small fogs as she ran. Rain watched the dust from her arms, as if it were scrubbing away the house's memory. She walked a step behind Sam as if she expected anyone to be waiting, because when the world is unpredictable, you practice expecting the worst and are surprised when the best happens. They ducked into the back of the van because it was an island in a city that sometimes tossed stones. Sam closed the doors and leaned his forehead against the cool metal. The van smelled of cardboard and the ghost of coffee. Isabella sat cross-legged on a stack of boxes, fingers worrying the charm on her wrist. "What's your last name?" he asked, trying to make a list. Names were anchors when everything else tried to drift away. "Hale," she answered with a wrinkle of bitterness. "Isabella Hale. But they—" She stopped. Naming the family was like putting a brand on her. She could feel the consequences float in the air. Sam pulled out his phone and checked the recording. The file was messy, but the voices were there, muffled and fainter because of the rain in the distance, and yet they held what they needed. Stella's laugh, Mark's slow assurances, the phrase he had dreaded, "We make it final." He could rewind and hear it again and again until the words lost their sting and became keys. "Okay," Sam said. "We listen, we stay quiet, we make a plan." He realized how small and huge that sentence was. It marked the soft conversion of an ordinary delivery man into something else, someone willing to risk his job, his safety, and perhaps his anonymity for another person's life. Isabella surprised him by moving from fear to a practicalness born of necessity. She had an eye for small things that adults overlooked: an old envelope with handwriting on it, a receipt with a lawyer's name, a calendar page with a date circled in thick ink. When she spoke about the house, she was clear. People came and went, always smiling, always bringing forms or papers that looked like business but smelled of final decisions.
She pointed to the backroom window where the adults had kept a ledger in a drawer, a notebook with names and transfers, notes about coverage, a thin trail that smelled of motive. Sam imagined the two of them as a poor silhouette on a bright stage, a driver and a child against a set of wealthy faces. He knew that the first act had to be survival, the second would be evidence, the third, he tried not to think too far yet, would be exposure, the public tearing aside of a meticulously arranged lie. "Don't call the police," Isabella said quietly. "They'll say I'm confused. They'll say I'm too young to remember. They'll close the house with candles and a pastor, and Daddy will sign something in Geneva, and the world will keep going." Sam understood the calculus. Calling authorities could be both shelter and a rallying horn for the exact people they needed to avoid. Stella and Mark had a network. They had rehearsed grief and cultivated trust among the right people. They had a lawyer ready to speak in measured tones. They had influence that could reroute suspicion. Sam had a phone recording and a van. The scale was mismatched, and that mismatch was a kind of honesty. He made two choices in the span of an exhale. First, they would not drive to the nearest precinct. Second, Sam would turn invisible not as a resignation but as a tactic. He would use the fact that no one noticed him to move through places where others could not. He would be the hand that rearranged facts into something the world could read. They left the van and walked to a cafe where the city stored its warmth. They sat at a back table, both of them wet and inhaling the smell of baked bread. Sam paid for 2 hot chocolates with hands that shook a little, not from the cold, but from the scale of what they had stepped into. Isabella spoke with the care of someone reading from memory, and her memory was ledger drawer and the date circled for memorial arrangements. "They're building the story," she said, stirring her chocolate. Sam listened, playing the conversation back in his head. He pictured the subtle steps Stella and Mark had taken, calls to a funeral planner, a fabricated road accident they could point to as cause, a closed casket that meant no one would see too closely. They had thought everything through except for one variable, a delivery driver who happened to have grown up in apartments with more exits than people, and a child who kept memories like pebbles in her pocket. They needed proof, not just testimony, not the fragile outrage of a neighbor's rumor. They needed something that could be replayed, published, and trusted. The recording in Sam's pocket was one thread.
Isabella had named people, provided locations, and hinted at a ledger with transactional evidence. It was enough to begin assembling a pattern, but patterns require corroboration. Sam considered allies. There was a reporter he sometimes bumped into at the distribution center, a young woman named Maya, who had an eye for stories that smelled of scandalous oxygen. There was also Louis, a mechanic in a garage who kept old uniforms and a wide mouth for gossip. But Sam had to move carefully. A wrong ear could trip alarms. Stella and Mark had practiced their performance for an audience. They would have rehearsed for any interruption. "How do you get into that ledger?" Sam asked. It sounded like a stupid question, but he needed a starting point. Isabella's jaw set. "There's a key," she said. "They keep it in a mug with chips, by the kettle." Her finger tapped the table to mark the cadence of the sentence. "I can show you." When she spoke, she transformed from prey to collaborator. The decision to involve her in any evidence gathering was moral and necessary. She had a stake, a right to agency. She refused to be merely rescued. She wanted to know the faces and the phrases that had put her in the dark. She wanted to be the one who took the photograph that would break the pattern. Sam looked at her and swallowed. The idea of putting a frightened child into the middle of a plan that could expose them to danger made his stomach clench.
And yet, she had plans of her own. To deny her involvement would be to strip her of the small power that had kept her in the house this long. "We'll take pictures," he said finally. "You show me the mug with the key. We take a photograph of the ledger, the receipts, anything that can connect names to transactions. Then we get it to someone who can't be bought." "Who?" Isabella asked. Her eyes were a blunt instrument. "Who can't be bought?" Sam thought of the reporter Maya with hair like quicksilver and a ledger of published pieces that had people in power blink. He thought of a local community lawyer he had once delivered parcels to, an older woman who wore her ethics like a stubborn coat. He did not know if either would be immune, only that they had records, bylines, and the inclination to ask loud questions. They left the cafe with two goals: photos and a place to hide. The city folded around them in its indifferent way. Sam drove slowly, keeping to curves and alleys like a cartographer mapping caution. Isabella's head lay on the cool plastic of the van's floor for a few minutes. She closed her eyes and allowed herself a breath that was not measured for peril. They reached a small apartment above a printing shop. Sam had friends there, sympathetic in the way community cockets are. A bed, a lock, and sympathetic faces. Leah, who ran the print shop, took one look at them and did not ask a single judgmental question. She made space without prying.
The van stayed parked 2 streets over, its engine off and its lights dimmed. In a city of faces, it was easier to hide in plain sight. That night, Sam and Isabella worked with slow, painstaking stealth. Isabella guided him through the kitchen of the shuttered house, in a memory reconstructed like glass. She remembered the mug with chips and the drawer. She whispered the route through the rooms the way a child recites the safest path through a storm. They took photos with their phones, the ledger with entries scrawled in the same ink, a line that matched a specific legal firm, an appointment card, a printed receipt with a wire transfer number. Each image was a small, dangerous puzzle piece. The recording Sam had, his voice memo, proved more than he'd hoped. When he cleaned the audio and played it through headphones, Stella's laugh was sharp and familiar, and Mark's tone had a parenthetical, cruel humor to it. There was a phrase he could now freeze and write down. "Once the will is signed, the rest becomes manageable." It was not an admission of a crime, but it was a thread that, pinned by enough other threads, dates, names, transfer numbers, could be pulled taut until an entire scheme unraveled. They worked late into the night, hands dirty with the residue of other people's lives, piecing together the outline of what Stella and Mark had contrived. They gave the photos to Leah, who printed hard copies and hid them in the lining of an old coat that nobody would think to look in. Sam uploaded the audio to a cloud account he believed to be secure. The tiny charm on Isabella's bracelet caught the kitchenette light and reflected a small, steadfast hope. It could be used as identification, as a humanizing symbol against the sterile typography of legal filings. None of it felt heroic yet. There was no triumphant music, no garlands, only the clump of a heartbeat and the weight of responsibility. They were building a case from fragments. They were building a life from small acts of attention. At dawn, while the city still wore the bruised colors between night and morning, Sam drove them back to the block of shuttered houses. He parked 2 avenue blocks away and watched the house from a distance, as if it were a creature with a routine. Stella and Mark were there in ways that made his skin want to crawl. A car that pulled up briefly, a figure delivering flowers to a porch they were not supposed to visit yet. They had a calendar, a plan. The date circled in Isabella's memory approached with the inevitability of a legal seal. Sam slid a surveillance camera under the van seat, a cheap device he knew how to operate. He set it to record motion. He left it with the humility of someone who knew his limits. It wasn't a war chest. It was a scrap of tech and commitment. He would gather what he could without putting Isabella into a position that might expose her to immediate danger. As he turned to walk away, his phone buzzed with one message that made the blood in his ears thud. A news alert. The headline was bland and efficient. Hale family mourns tragic loss. Memorial planned for Saturday. A photograph of Stella, styled, composed, filled the screen with the kind of grief that could be bought, practiced, and distributed. Readers would react with condolences. The public would form opinions in a neat line. The narrative was already half sewn. Sam slid the phone back into his pocket and felt the tightness of it like a ring. He had a plan that involved patience and careful exposure. He knew, too, that to win against people willing to construct a legend about death, they would have to force the truth into a place of light, a place where reputations could be questioned in real time, where perfumed grief could falter in front of audio and photographs. That night, as rain replaced its earlier drizzle with a deliberate downpour, Sam listened to the recording again until the words lost their right to be comfortable. He looped the laughter and the phrase about making things final until he could recite it in the exact cadence the conspirators had used. He showed it to Maya, the reporter, on a promise backed by a meeting cut in a parking lot, but did not give over the full cache of evidence. He watched her face change from curiosity to professional alarm and back to the kind of neutrality that meant she would, if she believed it, look deeper. "This is not nearly enough on its own," she told him softly, when the car's heater hummed and they sat in the dark. "We need a ledger entry, a bank transfer, something a judge can see without a tear in the prosecution's sleeve. If it goes to a court of public opinion first, they can spin it into tragedy and stonewall the rest." Sam nodded. He had guessed as much. Public exposure could be a blunt instrument that smashes as readily as it reveals. The safer path, he realized, was to assemble the little artifacts into a coherent whole that would stand up when turned under the light of scrutiny. But time was not on their side. The memorial was close, and a well-timed funeral is an effective eraser. Isabella, when she was not tucked under a blanket at Leah's apartment, rehearsed the details of her memory like a small witness preparing a testimony. She practiced saying dates and names clearly. She refused to let pity direct her voice. She wanted to be a participant, not a passive artifact of other people's stories. She asked questions about what could happen if they were found with the ledger photos on them. Sam answered honestly. There were risks, but not action. They would not trade in violence. They would use patience, exposure, and the stubbornness of small truths. At some point that week, Stella came by the neighborhood. Sam watched from a distance as she stepped from her car, a pillowy smile in place and a bouquet of white lilies in her hand.
Cameras had already been arranged by someone eager for the grieving family shot. The world was getting ready to buy a narrative. Mark called her from the car with a voice full of strategy. He said a time, he said names, he said the thing that made Sam's chest tighten. Perfect. We move the service forward. We make sure it's public enough that no one asks questions. Sam felt the phrase in his teeth like a splinter. Public enough. An engineer of absence had studied how many eyes were needed to secure a lie. They had not accounted for one thing: the unpredictable stickiness of human attention when trained towards justice. He took a breath and thought of what this would mean for Isabella. She would be buried in the collective grief of strangers before anyone had asked whether the grief was deserved. Sam imagined her tiny bracelet preserved in a faded photograph on a news site. He imagined the ledger in a lawyer's drawer while the world moved along. He refused the picture. "We need a moment," he said to Leah and Maya in the cramped back room where they had laid out the evidence, the printouts stacked like small flags. "We need to force them to act where their lies can be matched by proof. Not a vigil, not a quiet funeral, something where they can't hide behind a closed casket." Maya looked at him with the look of someone trying to find the rumor in the rumor mill that becomes news. Leah looked with the practical eyes of someone who could hide a person and a set of papers without letting the city notice. Isabella sat and watched them like a judge listening to advocates. Sam formed the idea there in the small room lit by the hum of a refrigerator and the rain outside. It would be a ruse, a public moment that would work like a hinge. It was dangerous, and he could feel the danger as a pressure on his chest, like a hand that might push him hard. But it was also a way to flip the script. Instead of Stella and Mark controlling the story at a memorial, they would be forced into a live exposure where their own voices could be used as evidence. The plan crystallized slowly, almost reluctantly. They would need to make Stella and Mark believe they had succeeded in erasing Isabella. They would let them perch there, comfortable and perfumed, until they were lured into making themselves known in a public way. Then, at the appointed moment, the proof would be released: audio, photos of ledger entries, a witness who could attest to Stella and Mark's performances. It would be messy, it would be theatrical, it would be a trap that used the conspirators' need for spectacle against them. Isabella listened, and when asked, nodded. She was not naive about risk. She had seen the way people could change their faces at will, but she also knew that she had a right to be seen alive rather than to be mourned dearly. Her decision was not passive.
She wanted the adults who had attempted to erase her life to stand in front of other people and be unmasked by their own words. She was small and ferocious in a way that was disproportionate and admirable. Sam felt something like a vow settle in him. He had never imagined himself a hero. He had imagined himself invisible,
a man whose daily contributions were accepted and then set aside. But invisibility, he realized, contained a kind of power. It allowed him to move under expectations. He could be anonymous in a world that expected attention only to those who scream loudest. The plan would ask him to convert that invisibility into a focused weapon of truth. He also understood he had to turn his anonymity into a shield for Isabella. The two of them would have to become a singular unit, small, focused, and resistant to pressure. They would use press and law and human persistence as tools. They would not invent violence. They would not try to be judge and jury. They would bring daylight where people had plotted under shade. The first section of the plan required deception that felt like mercy. They would let the world arrange a memorial that Stella and Mark controlled, a public scene where the two conspirators would be coaxed by their own need for spectacle into speaking lines that could be recorded. Sam would not risk a confrontation. He would orchestrate a situation where the conspirators' overconfidence became evidence. The pieces were small and fragile. Time ticked at the edges of Sam's plan, and with each tick, the risk thickened. He understood there were consequences. He also understood that inaction meant handing Isabella over to a story that would reduce her to a photograph and a quote. That night, as the city slept under rain, and the van sat like an unremarkable piece of furniture, Sam sat on the edge of a bed and looked at Isabella, who had wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. She was learning to sleep again, and almost criminal luxury. He had a van full of packages, a recording that could shift the weight of truth, and a decision carved like a keen instrument in his mind. They would not let a story be sold when a life remained to be lived. He did not yet know how Stella and Mark would respond when the first pieces of proof were thrust into daylight. He only knew that if they failed to act quickly and cleverly, the story would be owned by those who had practiced grief like a garment. And if they succeeded, the cost might be everything he had to give. Outside, the rain slowed to a hush. The city's lights kept vigil. Sam pressed his hand against the charm of Isabella's bracelet as it lay on the bedside table and felt the delicate metal warm to his touch. He felt the ordinary man inside him shift. He accepted the role of a kind of invisible muscle, a delivery driver who had carried more than parcels that day. He had picked up a pulse and decided to follow it. Morning arrived with a brittle light. The memorial was 3 days away.
Sam checked the manifest on his phone, and for the first time since he could remember, a delivery was more than a delivery. It was a deadline that cut both ways. He would need to be two people at once, the quiet worker the city expected, and a man who could, when pressed, step forward and shout a truth loud enough to pierce rehearsed sorrow. He slid the thumb across his screen, opening and closing windows like a person prying at a lock. The recording sat there, small and crackly and honest, and the photographs dimpled in the cloud like evidence waiting on a shelf. There would be 100 ways to fail, but there was also, finally, a pathway. He stood, gathered his jacket, and for the first time in months, left the apartment with a plan that was larger than a delivery route. He took Isabella's hand as they stepped into the rain-slick street. She squeezed back, not because she feared what would come, but because she had chosen, in that pinch, to trust. They moved together toward a future that looked uncertain and strangely full of possibility. They moved toward a memorial that would either bury the truth or give them a stage. Somewhere between those two outcomes was the hinge of justice, and Sam intended to find it. As the van's wipers sang across the glass and city traffic glowed like distant stars, a thought threaded through Sam's mind like a small, bright wire. If you make yourself seen just long enough, you can unmake a lie. He squeezed Isabella's hand and kept driving into the wet geometry of the morning, invisible no more to the life he had chosen to protect. The day they planned to take the stage arrived like a held breath. Streets that had been ordinary the week before now thrummed with florist vans and men in dark coats carrying programs. White lilies softened curves. A rented podium waited with a microphone tuned to carry just enough grief to satisfy strangers. The city, hungry for tidy narratives, had already selected its sympathy. Sam watched from a distance, feeling the strange vertigo of someone who had stepped from being unseen into the frame of something larger than himself. He had rehearsed logistics with Maya until the plan was a map of small, unflashy actions, where she would stand with her camera,
how Leah would hand off physical copies of the ledger to a trustworthy legal aid at the back, the exact moment Isabella would be ready to shift from silent witness to declarant. No one was to shout or to physically confront. The idea was to force the conspirators to speak where their voices could be preserved, on air, on tape, under the scrutiny of people who could never again let them claim grief without consequence. Isabella slept fitfully that morning, the muscles around her jaw tight with anticipation.
She had insisted on dressing herself. The blue sweater she chose was threadbare but clean, and she pushed her hair behind her ears with hands that no longer trembled like the child who had first mouthed "help" into a gap in a boarded window. She had practiced the names she would say, the dates she would give. There was a steadiness in her now that felt like the cool side of courage, less dramatic than bravery, more like a small, unbending rod. They arrived early. Leah slipped Isabella into the crowd near the steps where mourners clustered, a place where the child's presence could be both visible and protected. Sam stayed on the periphery, a silhouette among umbrellas. Maya threaded cables, tested connections, and kept her face neutral. A lawyer named Daniel, quiet, pragmatic, stood near her with a briefcase that smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. He had agreed to take custody of the hard copies should the moment require it. His role was legal ballast, not theatrics. Stella arrived with the kind of grief that had been rehearsed into every angle of her face. Her smile, practiced and patient, softened the edges of suspicion. Mark walked beside her, a steady shadow. Cameras angled toward them. Reporters read their cue sheets like hymns. They stepped up to the microphone and began the performance the city expected. Measured words of sorrow, promises to honor and remember, references to the child's bright future that the public would tuck into the tidy box of condolence. Sam felt the knuckles of his hand whiten around the strap of his bag. His device was small, almost ridiculous, an old phone with the audio cleaned and compressed, and an extra battery taped beneath a stack of duplicate receipts. Leah had sewn copies of the ledger into an inside pocket of a coat she wore, and Daniel stood ready to hand them to a court clerk if necessary. Maya counted silently, watching the expression on Stella's face for the micro-movements Isabella had pointed out in weeks of small observation. "We're forever changed," Stella said, voice silk and measured. It was a line that should have felt human. Instead, it had the precise cadence of performance. Isabella watched from the crowd and then, when Daniel gave the small nod they had rehearsed, stood and stepped forward. The murmur around her sharpened into attention, an instinctive, hungry curiosity that modern crowds perform when given a gap in the script. Sam moved closer, staying at the edge of the circle of people like a protective weight. Isabella's voice cut through the prepared phrases with a clarity that surprised some and unnerved others. "You don't get to speak for me," she said, and the sound of it felt like a small, clean wind across the stage of roses and papers. The microphone picked her up. The world was tuned for those willing to mourn, but not always for those who insisted on being present. Stella's smile flickered.
Mark looked at her, then at the cameras, then back at Isabella, as if trying to read whether the child's presence would further the story he had paid to manufacture. He opened his mouth in that practiced way people do when they intend to redirect sympathy. "This is not the place," he began. Maya, who had been running the feed quietly to a small but growing online audience, let the camera roll and keyed a playlist into the console. At Leah's cue, Daniel stepped forward with the printed ledger and a set of photos. He did not shout. He held them like evidence before a judge of the world. Clear snapshots of the entries, the handwriting matched to the names Isabella had given, receipts with transfers to accounts that corresponded to a string of shell payments. "They've been planning this," Isabella said, each name she spoke precise as a nail. "They called it final and manageable. They made lists and paid for things. They thought no one would hear them. They were wrong." For a moment there was stunned silence, an awkward pause when a well-burnished narrative collides with something that refuses to be pretty. Then, as if prompted by a shared instruction, a reporter shouted a question, and a handful of phones rose like tiny flares. Mark's face hardened, and Stella's eyes flashed, not with grief but with the awareness that their stage had shifted beneath them. Sam hit play on the cleaned audio. The sound that spilled out was not cinematic, it was raw, domestic, the timing of laughter and the hint of champagne couched in talk about steps and documents. Stella's laugh, captured months earlier behind a cracked door, floated over the crowd. The phrase, "We make it final," hung in the air and then was repeated, clearer, with the cadence that had made Sam's skin crawl in the boarded house.
When people heard what sounded like giddy triumph paired with talk of documents and transfers, confusion rewired into outrage. A camera panned and caught Mark's mouth as it moved into a semblance of protest. He tried to say, "That's out of context," a stock phrase people use when they wish to paper over the implication of their own words. But the ledger photos were already making the rounds amid the crowd, printed copies in hands, a live stream showing screen captures. The city's appetite for a neat story had been diverted into attention sharp enough to cut. Stella's voice cracked, not in sorrow, but in the thinness of someone caught lying. "You can't prove," she began, and then stopped because the evidence was already arranged to answer that challenge. Maya had already placed a call to a reporter from a major outlet. Within minutes, what had been a neighborhood memorial was a live feed with context, and the tide of public witness turned. Sam watched the micro-gestures he had studied in the house unfold in front of him. Mark's hand started to shake when his phone buzzed with a message whose content he could not control.
In his pocket, the ledger entries made a pattern: payments, names, dates. Daniel read them aloud, concealing nothing, his voice calm and exact. As he spoke, a uniformed officer, called by a neighbor who had seen too many red flags, moved through the crowd. There was no cinematic baton of justice. There were small, procedural steps. A sergeant asking for identification, an officer listening to recorded statements, a line of people offering testimony. "You have to understand," Mark pleaded to the circle that now formed, but people no longer supplied him the benefit of narrative. The public record had been assembled into something a prosecutor could look at, a visible thread unspooling from the house to the accounts to the rehearsed condolences. Adrian Hale arrived late, stepping out of a town car like a man traveling with the burden of a passport and a wardrobe. He had been in Geneva, the world had told them, and his presence now stirred the crowd. He looked stricken at first, then confused, then steadily furious as he was fed copies of the ledger and the audio. Someone in the inner circle that had once smoothed his life into manageable choices had been feeding him a version of events designed to protect their interests. He listened to Isabella speak and to the evidence assembled, and then, in a voice that overrode the murmurs, asked a question that cut through the noise. "Did she ever tell you to do this?" Isabella met him with a look that held more judgment than accusation. "No," she said. "They told me stories about getting better, about programs. They told me my father agreed. I don't know if he did." The admission was simple and brutal in its directness. She had been spoken about as if she were a prop. Adrian faltered. For a man accustomed to being framed with careful narratives, this jagged truth required a different response. He called an aide and then took Isabella's hand, tentatively at first, as if testing whether she belonged to him. But his touch was not automatic reconciliation. It was the start of something that would require work, conversations, and answers in places a press conference could not hold. He asked for Daniel's card and sat with the lawyer as officers took formal statements. The crowd did not let the moment settle into spectacle. A local TV van rolled up, and now the ledger entries in the audio, small, stubborn objects, moved into recorded evidence that prosecutors would not be able to ignore. Mark was detained, not because the crowd demanded blood, but because officers, faced with concrete leads in the admission in Isabella's testimony, had probable cause to ask difficult questions. Stella argued. She made the same case they'd rehearsed in private. Grief, confusion, misunderstanding. But the ledger showed otherwise. The public moment had become a legal hinge. Sam kept to the edges. His name surfaced slowly into conversation as the driver who had brought a child out of a boarded house.
People called him the delivery driver, with a quality of surprised reverence that made him uneasy. He had not sought to be a hero. He had wanted to keep a child from being memorialized alive. Watching the practical wheels of accountability turn, he felt the rush of relief, and also a wary caution. Justice was not something that finished in a single afternoon. It was a process with jagged edges, and they were only at the beginning. In the days that followed, the case expanded. A grand jury was referenced on the news. Lawyers from multiple firms stepped into view, and reporters tracked bank transfers and correspondence that matched the ledger. Adrian, once distanced by travel and obligations, chose to remain in the city and to cooperate with investigators. His presence did not erase the weeks Isabella had lived through, but it meant someone with resources and a stake in truth now listened. Leah kept Isabella with her for a time. The print shop became a safe place where the child could do ordinary things, eat cereal at a table, pick out a comic book, without microphones. Sam kept making deliveries, though they were different now. Occasionally he dropped off a passport, sometimes a stack of legal documents. People in the neighborhood began to nod at him on the street, some with a recognition that meant more than thanks. The van's bumper bore a new smudge of paint, where someone had drawn a dolphin with chalk. Isabella had insisted on it, and the image became a small, private flag. The trial that eventually formed from the investigation was not immediate. Law had its pace and many cautious conversations, and there were hearings where evidence was scrutinized and objections made. The conspirators changed defenses: confusion, misinterpretation, grief misapplied. But the ledger lines, the audio, the receipts, and the testimony, the combination of human memory and paper trail, held up. Prosecutors do not love drama, they love corroboration. The kind of boring, methodical work that had started in Sam's pocket and in Isabella's memory turned out to be the most effective instrument they had. One public hearing before the case moved to a formal trial became a turning point for the community. The courthouse gallery filled with people who had watched the memorial video months earlier: neighbors, reporters, activists. Cameras swirled. The judge read procedural statements with an almost ceremonial rhythm. In the witness box, Isabella sat in a chair that made her look smaller and larger at once. Small because of her body, larger because of the force with which she spoke the facts. She did not shout. She did not fall apart. She told the story with the quiet force she had practiced in the cafe, narrating small details that stitched together the ledger's numbers into motives and the audio's laughter into action. People listened not because they were entertained, but because the testimony demanded the recalibration of how they had once thought about grief and guardianship. When it came time for the press to step into the courthouse steps afterward, cameras captured a scene of restrained victory. Mark and Stella led away in cuffs, faces taut, lawyers murmuring in controlled panic. Paperwork filed, charges pending. There would be no heroic, instantaneous sentence, but there was an undeniable shift. The public account had been corrected. Where there had been deception practiced like an art form, there was now a public record that would follow the conspirators into the lit rooms of the legal system. The aftermath was more tender than triumphant. There were no fireworks, only the slow, deliberate work of unmaking a life built on falsehoods. Isabella reclaimed things that had been taken from her only in imagination and in document: a stuffed rabbit she'd loved, the small sketchbook where she drew a boat, a box of jewelry that contained the bracelet with the dolphin. She reclaimed corners of rooms and routines, the kind of ordinary practices that mark a life as one's own. Adrian visited often. He did not perform immediate redemption. He showed up and listened. He apologized in small, real ways. He took a parenting class with a humility that was not televised. He met with counselors organized by the community center. He removed a series of portraits from walls to make space for conversation. Isabella watched him closely, measuring words against actions. Forgiveness, when it came, felt cautious and earned, rather than a headline that could be placed on a weekend. Sam found his reward in the soft currency of gratitude that was not for headlines but for private things. A handwritten note from Isabella arrived, crude and earnest. "Thank you for not letting me be a picture." Leah kept making him coffee without comment. Maya wrote a piece that did not sensationalize his life, but focused on the anatomy of courage, a man who had used his invisibility like a tool for attention to the vulnerable. People stopped stepping over him in the street. They started making room. There were moments that felt ceremonial in their simplicity. When the house where Isabella had been kept was condemned and slated for demolition, a small crowd gathered. Some wanted to see the place razed, a final act of severing. Others wanted to leave a token, a stone, a note, a bracelet placed on the portrail. Isabella, with Adrian beside her and Sam in the back like a watchful, anonymous force, took a hammer to the small plaque that someone had already put in the ground as part of Stella and Mark's earlier program of manufactured mourning. A neat stone with Isabella's name carved into it in a font the conspirators had chosen for its photogenic quality. She held the hammer awkwardly, like someone learning how to do a simple grown-up thing for the first time, and struck the stone. Chips flew.
The sound was small and sharp. Then she took a second strike and a third, and the plaque fractured. People cheered in a low human way, not triumphal, but relieved. The broken stone was not destruction, it was reclamation. The fragments were gathered and placed in a box that Isabella kept, a reminder of a time when she had refused to be erased. Sam watched her, feeling the weirdness of seeing someone he had helped now reclaim her life. He was still a delivery driver, he still knew every alley and every doormat, but there was a subtle change in how the city seemed to regard him, not with a blank passing glance, but with recognition. Once the world required him to be invisible. Now it had seen what he could do with that invisibility when used for someone else. Weeks later, on a morning that smelled of toast and the less dramatic business of living, Sam and Isabella walked to a small park. She sat on a bench and took a stone from a pocket, one of the plaque fragments, and tucked it into a small tin she had decorated with a dolphin drawn in crayon. "For remembering," she said, and the simplicity of it made Sam laugh. "Does it still feel like you're carrying too much?" he asked, the old concern that had been one of his compass points since the first night in the van. "No," she said. "It feels lighter, like I'm the one holding it now." He nodded and watched a dog chase a squirrel, watched people walk by in ordinary patterns. The city moved on, as cities do, but for Isabella and for Sam, the motion was now part of a new pattern. Justice had not been a single blaze of finality. It was a sequence of small, honest things, a ledger printed, a voice recorded, a child who remembered names. Word spread quietly about the driver who had listened. People inside his route started leaving him notes with appreciation rather than the usual clip thanks. One day a neighbor handed him a small box with a ribbon, a token for the cost of cake, and a note that read simply, "For what you did." He put it on his dashboard next to the service stickers, and for a moment allowed himself to feel seen. The city still had its dark corners. The legal system remained cumbersome and slow. There would be hearings, testimony, adjusted lives. But there was also a new logic, a public willingness to look closer when something smells practiced. Stella and Mark's performance that had almost erased a child had been interrupted not by a single hero, but by a combination of small, persistent actions. Sam had been necessary, but he was not the only force. He never wanted to be the story's center. He wanted Isabella to have that place. On a quiet afternoon months later, as Sam made his rounds, he found Isabella waiting by the gate of a small community garden. She held out a ribbon, the same blue as her sweater had been, and tied it to his van's mirror. "So you don't get lost," she said with a cheeky grin. He touched the ribbon and felt the strange warmth of being recognized.
"You sure you don't want me to be dramatic and wear a cape?" he asked. She rolled her eyes. "No, capes are impractical for deliveries." Then, softer, "Thank you." He shrugged, the smallest of gestures, and looked at the city he knew like a palm. Being invisible had been his design, a way of moving through life's margins without asking for notice. But now, when someone glanced his way and slipped a simple nod, he felt something akin to quiet belonging. As they walked away from the garden, Isabella skipping ahead, Sam thought of the bracelet with the dolphin that had first signaled a life worth saving. He thought of the ledger printed on a kitchen table, of the audio that had sounded like laughter, and then like a confession, of the way a community, when pushed, had chosen to hold the truth. There would be no grand end to this. The legal process continued, the city continued to turn, and Sam returned to his route with a new ease in his steps. He delivered packages that, for the first time, felt less like anonymous burdens, and more like the small, meaningful exchanges they were. He kept a photograph taped inside his van, a candid shot taken by Maya of Isabella laughing at Leah's print shop, unguarded, an image he looked at on hard days. When the trial concluded months later with convictions that were neither miraculous nor fully redeeming, the news reported the facts, charges, sentencing recommendations, pending appeals. The headlines were dry and legalistic, but beneath that reportage lay a community rearranged by a child's insistence on being present, and by a delivery driver who had listened when the city expected him to keep moving. On the anniversary of Isabella's rescue, she and Sam returned to the boarded house, not to relive trauma, but to reclaim a small rhythm. They planted a sapling where the swing had hung. It was a modest thing, a tree that would take years to grow, a life that would stretch into seasons neither of them could yet imagine. Sam hammered in a small marker with a phrase Isabella insisted on. "Here we were noticed." They left the house then, hands sticky with soil, and walked to the van. People in the street nodded. A child playing nearby waved. Nothing decided in a single instant, and yet a subtle transformation had taken place. A community that once accepted rehearsed grieving had learned to ask uncomfortable questions. A girl who had been spoken for now spoke for herself. A delivery driver who had been invisible had, by listening and acting, made a life visible. Back in his seat, Sam started the engine and pulled away. The city unfolded, orders and streets and small necessary chores waiting. He drove with the feeling of someone who had carried more than parcels, had carried a responsibility, and who would carry it as long as needed. Isabella's laughter, tinny and real, followed him like a small, honest echo.
If this story reached you and moved something in you, an anger at injustice, a belief in quiet courage, remember how change began, with listening, with small acts of proof, with people who refuse to let a child be reduced to an image. If you want more stories that honor truth and courage in ordinary lives, subscribe and join us for more.